The temperature dropped faster than anyone in the valley had expected. By 9 o'clock on the evening of January 14th, 1887, the thermometer nailed to the trading post wall in Harlan Creek, Montana Territory, had fallen to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius. The kind of cold that doesn't creep in through the gaps in your walls. It forces its way in. It finds the knots in the timber. It follows the nail heads. It sits on your chest while you sleep and dares you to keep breathing. Every cabin in the settlement was burning wood that night. You could see the smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, pale gray against a sky so black and clear it looked like a wound. Families were piling coats onto their children. Men were feeding their fires every hour. The Calloway brothers burned through almost a full cord of split pine between sundown and midnight, and their front room still barely crept above 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius. But on the eastern edge of Harlan Creek, past the old cattail marsh, past the 2 dead cottonwood trees everyone used as a landmark, something strange was happening. One structure had no smoke rising above it, no chimney visible from the trail, no orange glow through a window. And yet, inside, a man named Elias Drummond was sleeping soundly, wrapped in a single wool blanket, his stack of firewood bone dry and barely touched, while the rest of the settlement shivered through the longest night of that brutal winter. Nobody believed him when he said it had worked. Not at first, but the cold doesn't lie. If you've ever wondered how the old-timers built things that seemed to defy logic, things that worked when everything else failed, then this story is for you. Like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We're here to dig up the engineering that the frontier never wrote down, to understand what Elias Drummond built, and why everyone laughed at him for building it. You have to understand what Harlan Creek was in the autumn of 1886. It wasn't a town, not yet. It was a collection of intentions. 17 families, most of them arrived within the last 3 years, scattered along a creek bottom in the eastern foothills of the Rockies. The nearest supply depot was a 2-day ride south. Timber was available, but felling, splitting, and drying it was punishing work. A family of 4 could burn through 3 to 4 cords of wood between October and March, and that was if they were careful. If they weren't, or if the winter ran long, they could find themselves burning green wood by February, which produced smoke more than heat and left creosote packed thick in the chimney flue. The winters in that part of Montana Territory were not merely cold. They were architectural. They tested every joint, every gap, every decision a man made the previous summer. Local accounts from that era describe temperatures regularly falling below minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius for stretches of a week or more. Wind came down from a northwest with a consistency that settlers learned to read like a calendar. When the cattails bent south, you had perhaps 4 days before the next hard freeze. The standard cabin in Harlan Creek followed a pattern most settlers already knew. A single rectangular room, square-hewn log walls, a stone or clay and stick chimney on the south or west gable, a packed earth floor, and a single south-facing window covered with oiled muslin or, for the better-resourced families, a small pane of factory glass. Roofs were either sod laid over pole, framing, or split shakes, depending on what a man could get to before the ground froze. They were functional structures. They kept the wind out, but they bled heat constantly, relying on a continuous fire to maintain anything close to livable temperature. The moment the fire died, in the middle of the night, when the wood ran low, or when someone fell ill, the interior temperature dropped within 2 hours to within 10 or 15 degrees of the outside air. This was the world Elias Drummond had moved into 18 months earlier, with a young wife, 2 children under the age of 6, and a very specific memory he carried from his childhood in the hill country of eastern Tennessee. Elias Drummond was not an engineer. He had no formal schooling beyond what a church schoolroom in Cumberland County could offer a boy in the 1860s. He could read, he could cipher, and he could work, which on the frontier was generally considered sufficient credentials for most projects. But he had grown up watching his grandfather do something that nobody else in their hollow did. His grandfather, a stubborn Scots-Irish man named Calhoun, had dug into the hillside behind his cabin sometime in the 1840s. Not a root cellar, Exactly, though it served that purpose too. It was a combined structure, part storage, part woodshed, part sleeping room for the coldest stretches of January. The entrance faced east, away from the prevailing northwest wind. The roof was a low arch of hewn timbers packed with 2 feet of packed earth and sod. The walls were the hillside itself, reinforced with stone where the soil was loose. Young Elias had spent several winters sleeping in that earthen room when the main cabin grew too cold for the children. And what he remembered, what stuck with him across 3 decades, was the quiet. Not quiet of sound, but quiet of temperature. While the wind screamed and the thermometer dropped, the interior of that dug-in room barely moved. It would settle at around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 10 degrees Celsius, without any fire at all, simply from the thermal mass of the surrounding earth and the body heat of 3 or 4 people sleeping inside. 45 degrees isn't warm, but it is survivable. It is the difference between waking up and not. In the summer of 1886, Elias began digging into the north-facing bank behind his Harlan Creek cabin. He chose the north slope deliberately. It received less direct solar heating in summer, which meant the soil retained a more stable temperature year-round. He planned a structure roughly 14 feet wide and 22 feet deep, about 4.3 by 6.7 meters, with walls that would be the earth itself, insulated from the frost line down by the sheer volume of soil above and around them. The roof would be a low-pitched frame of pine poles, covered first with bark, then with 6 inches of dry grass, then with a final layer of sod blocks cut from the meadow above. The entrance tunnel, just 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, would face southeast, angled specifically to break the northwest wind while still admitting morning light. He was going to store his firewood inside. He was going to sleep inside if the winter demanded it. And if his calculations, rough as they were, written in pencil in the back of his wife Nora's Bible, held true, the interior temperature would never fall below freezing, with or without a fire. His neighbor, a man named Beckett Greer, watched him dig for 2 afternoons before he said anything. Then he said, "You're building a hole to die in, Drummond." Beckett Greer was not a cruel man. He was practical in the way the frontier required, measured, experienced, and deeply skeptical of ideas that deviated from what he had already seen survive a winter. He had been in Harlan Creek since 1883. He had buried a neighbor who trusted a poorly chinked cabin. He trusted what he knew. And what he knew was that you built above the ground, not into it. Earth holds moisture, he told Elias, standing at the edge of the excavation with his arms crossed, watching the younger man sharpen a digging bar against a flat rock. You'll have water seeping through those walls by November. Your wood will rot before it burns. It was a reasonable objection. In many soil types, he would have been right. Clay-heavy soils retain moisture and can wick it sideways through a wall for months. Several settlers in similar climates had attempted dugout structures and abandoned them after one wet spring turned the floor to mud. But Elias had chosen his site carefully. The bank he was digging into was predominantly decomposed granite and coarse sand, the kind of soil that drains quickly and holds little moisture once the surface layer dries. He had dug a test hole the previous spring and returned to it 3 weeks after a heavy rain. The bottom was dry. He explained this to Beckett. Beckett shrugged. "Still a hole," he said. "Still dark. Still smells like a grave." Others had more pointed objections. Miles Okafor, who ran the small sawmill 2 miles north and had more practical construction experience than anyone else in the settlement, stopped by one afternoon to look at the progress. He studied the dimensions, the angle of the entrance tunnel, the way Elias was cutting the sod blocks for the roof. "Your roof load is wrong," Miles said, not unkindly. 6 inches of wet sod after a snowfall will be pushing 300 pounds per linear foot on those center poles. You'll need to double your ridge support, or that comes down in February. This was valuable. Elias thanked him and quietly increased his center ridge poles from 2 to 4, each one notched and seated into the rear earthen wall for maximum bearing. He added 2 interior support posts, rough cut from green pine, tamped into flat stones set into the floor. He wasn't too proud to hear a good objection. But the commentary didn't stop at the structural. Margaret Finch, whose husband ran the trading post, told Nora Drummond plainly that she thought Elias had gone peculiar from overwork. She meant it with some compassion. The frontier produced its share of men who worked themselves into odd decisions. A man's family belongs in a proper cabin, she said, not a badger den. By September, the structure was complete. The firewood, 2.5 cords of split pine and 1 cord of dense Rocky Mountain juniper, was stacked inside, split side up, in 2 rows against the north and south interior walls. The earthen floor was packed hard, slightly crowned at the center to drain any condensation toward the entrance tunnel. Elias covered the entrance with a double curtain. First a layer of stiff rawhide, then a heavy wool blanket soaked in linseed oil and hung from a timber header. The combination reduced wind infiltration to near zero while still allowing easy passage. Then he waited. The first hard frost came on October 9th. He checked the interior temperature using a small mercury thermometer he had ordered from a catalog the previous spring. The outside air was 19 degrees Fahrenheit, -7 degrees Celsius. Inside the shelter, the thermometer read 47 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees Celsius. He wrote the numbers in the back of the Bible, next to his earlier calculations. He said nothing to anyone yet. Ready for Chapter 5? We're about to hit the January blizzard, and the moment nobody in Harlan Creek could argue with the numbers anymore. October gave way to November the way it always did in that part of Montana Territory. Not gradually, but in a single afternoon that felt like a door slamming shut. The creek froze over on November 3rd. By the 7th, the first real snowfall had deposited 14 inches across the valley floor, bending the cattail stalks flat and burying the stumps from Elias's summer digging. The hillside above his shelter disappeared under a white roof that would not fully melt until April. Inside, the transformation was quieter than Elias had dared hope. The snowpack on top of the sod roof added an unplanned but significant layer of insulation. Each inch of dry snow trapping a column of still air between its crystals, performing the same function as the goose down quilts the wealthy families back east were sleeping under. By mid-November, with the outside temperature hovering around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, -15 degrees Celsius at night, the interior of the shelter was reading a steady 44 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 8 degrees Celsius, with no fire burning at all. This was the thermal mass doing exactly what Elias had remembered from his grandfather's hill in Cumberland County. The surrounding earth, several tons of it pressing in on all 4 sides and above, had been absorbing solar and geothermal energy all summer. It released that stored energy slowly, the way a hearthstone holds warmth long after the fire dies. Soil doesn't conduct heat quickly in either direction. It resists change. A wall of packed earth 8 feet thick is, in thermal terms, nearly immovable. It cannot be persuaded to drop its temperature in a single night the way a log wall can. The firewood stacked inside sat in air that never dipped below freezing. The split ends of the pine remained pale and clean. The juniper, dense, resinous, slow-burning, held its oils without the pitch freezing that made cold-stored wood harder to ignite. Nora Drummond, who managed the household's fire starting with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to waste nothing, noted that the wood from the shelter caught faster and burned longer than was stored in their open lean-to the previous winter. She wrote this in a letter to her sister in Tennessee that December. Her sister wrote back, asking if they were well. Elias, for his part, kept checking the thermometer and writing numbers in the Bible. He told almost no one, not because he was secretive by nature, but because he understood something about his neighbors. They would not believe a number. They would only believe a winter, and the winter was still coming. By the first week of December, the mood in Harlan Creek had shifted from cautious preparation to quiet anxiety. The Calloway brothers, the same men who would later burn through a cord of pine in a single night, had already gone through more than half their winter wood supply, and December had barely begun. They had built well by the standards of the settlement. A squared log cabin with a proper stone chimney, clay-chinked walls, and a reasonably tight roof. But the cabin sat on flat ground with no windbreak, facing directly into the northwest exposure. Every time the wind came down from the mountains, it found the north wall of that cabin like a hand pressing against a drum, pulling heat out through every log seam. This was the fundamental problem with above-ground construction in exposed positions. It wasn't just that the walls lost heat through conduction. They lost it through infiltration. Cold air forcing its way through gaps. Warm air drawn up through the chimney draft, even when the damper was partially closed. A conventional cabin in that climate, oral accounts suggest, could lose 40% of its firebox heat to infiltration alone. Heat that went up the chimney or leaked sideways through the walls before it ever reached a person sitting 6 feet away. Miles Okafor, at the sawmill, was burning through his hardwood reserves faster than his estimates had allowed. He had planned carefully, cut early, and stacked well, and still the numbers were trending wrong by mid-December. He began extending his workday to fell additional timber, which meant working in temperatures that hovered around zero before the morning light reached the valley floor. The settlement's pastor, a broad-shouldered man named Reverend Aldous Kern, had taken it upon himself to check on the older residents once a week. He visited the Drummond place on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, expecting to find Elias either burning wood at the standard rate or, as Beckett Greer had predicted, sitting in a damp hole regretting his choices. He found instead a family that appeared, almost unervingly, relaxed. The main cabin was warm. As expected, Nora kept a small fire in the hearth during the day. But Elias walked Reverend Kern down the short path to the shelter entrance, pulled back the oiled wool curtain, and the Reverend stepped inside. He stood there for a moment without speaking. "It's warmer in here than outside," he said, finally. "About 60 degrees warmer, most days," Elias said. He showed him the thermometer. The outside air that afternoon was 8 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 13 degrees Celsius. The shelter interior read 43 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Celsius. Reverend Kern looked at the 2 rows of stacked firewood, dry and pale under the low earthen ceiling. He looked at the packed floor, the ridge poles, the way the sod roof sat heavy and still above them. "How much wood have you burned in here?" he asked. "None," Elias said. "Not yet." The Reverend did not laugh. But he didn't speak to anyone about it either, not immediately. He was a careful man, and he knew that one warm afternoon in December proved nothing. The real winter was still 3 or 4 weeks away. It arrived on January 9th. The storm that came down from the northwest on the evening of January 9th, 1887, was not exceptional by the standards of that mountain range. It was simply a standard Montana winter event, the kind of weather the territory produced routinely and without apology. Winds sustained at 25 to 35 miles per hour, gusting to near 50. Snowfall accumulating at 2 inches per hour through the night. And behind the snow, the cold front that had been building over the Canadian plains for a week. Temperatures that fell from 10 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 12 degrees Celsius at sundown to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius by midnight, and held there. It did not relent for 5 days. Across Harlan Creek, the settlement entered a state of managed emergency. The Calloway brothers burned their remaining cord of pine in the first 2 nights and began pulling board from their lean-to for fuel by January 12th. Beckett Greer's cabin, despite its solid construction, dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius inside on the second night, when his chimney partially blocked from ice accumulation and the draft failed. He slept in his coat with his 2 dogs pressed against him and called it adequate. Miles Okafor's sawmill structure, larger, better insulated, and stocked with offcuts and slabs, held better than most. But he was burning 12 to 14 hours a day to keep his pipes from freezing and the interior above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius. His total wood consumption for those 5 days, by his own later accounting, was just over a cord and a half. Elias Drummond burned less than a quarter cord of wood across the entire 5-day storm. Let that number settle for a moment. While the rest of the settlement was feeding fires around the clock, some families sleeping in shifts to keep the firebox going, Elias was burning wood only in the main cabin hearth, for cooking and comfort in the evening hours. The shelter required no fire at all. On the morning of January 11th, with the storm at its peak and the outside temperature reading minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius, Elias checked the shelter thermometer. The interior read 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius. A drop of only 4 degrees from where it had been in mid-November, despite weeks of continuous cold and 5 days of the worst storm of the winter. The thermal flywheel, the enormous mass of earth surrounding the structure on all sides, had simply absorbed the assault. The cold front pressed against several feet of soil and lost. The soil did not care about the wind. It did not care about the temperature differential. It changed at its own pace, which was geological, not meteorological. The firewood inside remained dry. The split pine showed no ice crystals, no frost on the end grain, no swelling from moisture. When Nora pulled a piece from the interior stack to test it against a piece from their neighbor's outdoor supply on January 13th, the difference was immediate. Hers caught in under a minute with a single match. Her neighbor's outdoor stored wood, frozen, surface wet from snow infiltration, took nearly 10 minutes of coaxing and produced mostly smoke for the first quarter hour. Reverend Kern visited on January 15th, the day after the cold broke. He brought Beckett Greer with him. Neither man said much. They stood in the shelter entrance, looked at the thermometer, looked at the wood stacks, looked at each other. Beckett Greer said, "How deep is the roof from grade?" "Just under 2 feet of packed earth, plus the snow on top," Elias said. "About 30 inches total right now." Greer nodded slowly. "The snow helps. Snow's the best insulation you didn't have to do anything to get," Elias said. That was the end of the argument. Word travels differently in a small settlement than it does in town. There are no newspapers, no public meetings called for the purpose of announcing a discovery. Information moves the way heat moves in the structures Elias had been thinking about all summer, slowly at first, then gathering momentum as it finds willing material. By February, Beckett Greer had begun digging. He chose a south-facing bank on his property, a different orientation than Elias's north slope choice, and one that would require a more careful entrance design to avoid overheating in late winter sun. Elias spent an afternoon walking the site with him, explaining the logic of entrance angle, the importance of drainage in the floor, the minimum roof depth needed to carry a snowpack without settlement. He recommended at least 4 load-bearing ridge poles for a structure wider than 12 feet, and suggested Beckett line the lower foot of the interior walls with flat stone to manage any seasonal moisture wicking. Greer listened without interrupting. He built accordingly. Miles Okafor, whose sawmill gave him access to more timber than anyone else in the settlement, took the idea in a different direction. Rather than digging into a hillside, he constructed a semi-buried woodshed, a rectangular structure with its floor set 3 feet below grade, its walls built from rough-sawn planks packed on the outside, with a 12-inch layer of sawdust, a byproduct of his mill that he had previously considered waste. The sawdust, like the earth around Elias's shelter, provided a buffering layer of low-conductivity material between the interior air and the outside temperature. Local accounts from the following winter suggest his wood storage held above freezing throughout January and February, even during a cold snap that brought temperatures to minus 16 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 27 degrees Celsius for 8 consecutive days. By the spring of 1887, 4 additional families in the Harlan Creek area had built some version of the earthen or semi-buried storage and shelter structure. By the winter of 1888, oral accounts indicate that number had grown to at least 9, with variations adapted to different soil conditions, slope orientations, and available materials. None of them called it anything formal. There was no name for it, no patent, no article in a farming journal. It was simply the thing Elias Drummond had built, and it worked, and the winter had proved it, and that was enough. Elias himself added a small stone-lined fire pit near the entrance of the shelter in the autumn of 1887, not for primary heating, but for the occasions when the family needed to be inside for extended periods during storms. A small fire in a well-sealed earthen room, he found, could raise the interior temperature from 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius, to nearly 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius within 2 hours, and that warmth would linger for 6 to 8 hours after the fire died, held in place by the surrounding mass of earth that had already been pre-warmed by months of occupancy and ambient geothermal gradient. The wood consumption for that entire second winter, shelter and cabin combined, was 2 cords and 3/4. The Calloway brothers, in their above-ground cabin with no windbreak and no changes made, burned just over 5 cords. Same family size, same winter, same valley. The difference was the earth itself, doing what earth has always done, holding what it's given, releasing it slowly, outlasting everything that tries to rush it.